My daughter's husband dumped garbage juice on my head during the wedding. Every single guest laughed at me. My daughter didn't defend me. I didn't get angry. Instead, I grabbed the microphone and said 3 words that made him scream. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought my daughter's wedding day would be the day I finally understood who I really was to my own family. At 66 years old, I believed I had seen enough of life to know what to expect from people, even the ones closest to me. I was wrong. The morning started like any other wedding day should. I pressed my only good suit, the navy blue one I'd worn to 3 other weddings in the past 5 years. The fabric was getting thin at the elbows, but it was clean and respectable. I'd saved for months to buy Stella the pearl necklace she'd admired in the jewelry store window downtown, $2,400, more than my monthly Social Security check. But she was my daughter, my only child. I arrived at the venue early, hoping to help with last-minute preparations. The country club looked magnificent, draped in white silk and baby's breath. Everything was perfect, expensive, the kind of wedding I could never have afforded to give Stella myself. That honor belonged to Walter, her groom, who worked at some big corporate firm downtown and never let anyone forget it. "Dad, you're early," Stella said when she saw me, but there was no warmth in her voice. She looked stunning in her dress, like her mother had on our wedding day 28 years ago. For a moment I saw my Sarah again, and my chest tightened with the familiar ache of missing her. "I wanted to see if you needed anything," I offered, adjusting my tie nervously. Stella glanced around, then leaned closer. "Actually, could you maybe stay in the back during the ceremony? Walter's colleagues are here, and you know how important first impressions are." The words hit me like cold water, but I nodded. "Of course, sweetheart." The ceremony was beautiful. I watched from the last row as my daughter married a man who had never once looked me in the eye during their entire 2-year courtship. Walter came from money, old money, the kind that builds country club memberships and summer homes. I was a retired factory worker who lived in a 1-bedroom apartment and drove a 15-year-old Honda. During the reception, I sat at table 12, far from the wedding party, with distant relatives who barely acknowledged my presence. I watched Stella laugh and dance, looking happier than I'd seen her since her mother died 8 years ago. Maybe that was enough. Maybe knowing she was happy was all I needed. Then Walter stood up to make his speech. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate this wonderful day," he began, his voice carrying across the room with practiced confidence. "Stella and I are so grateful for your love and support." He talked about their future together, their plans to travel Europe for their honeymoon, the house they'd buy in Stella's mother's hometown. He thanked his parents, his best man, even the caterers, but he never mentioned me, not once. When he finished, the crowd applauded. I forced a smile and clapped along, my hands feeling heavy. "Now," Walter continued, his voice taking on a different tone, "I'd like to take a moment to address someone special." My heart lifted slightly. Maybe he would acknowledge me after all. "Stella's father, Martin, is here with us today." Walter's eyes found mine across the room. "I think it's time we all understood exactly what kind of man he is." The room fell silent. I felt every eye turn toward me, my face burning with sudden dread. Walter walked over to the bar and picked up a large glass pitcher. It was filled with what looked like brown, murky water, the kind of mixture you'd find at the bottom of a garbage can after a rainstorm. My stomach dropped as I realized what he was about to do. "This," Walter announced loudly, "is finally what you deserve." Before I could move, before I could even process what was happening, he dumped the entire contents over my head. The liquid was cold and sticky, smelling like rotting food and old coffee grounds. It soaked through my suit, dripped down my face, and pooled on the floor around my chair. The room erupted in laughter. Not the uncomfortable, awkward kind that happens when someone crosses a line. Genuine, hearty laughter. These people, Stella's wedding guests, were enjoying my humiliation. I looked at my daughter, expecting to see shock, anger, something that showed she would defend me. Instead, Stella covered her mouth with her hand, not in horror but to hide her own laughter. "Dad always was a mess," she said loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "At least now he looks like how he's always made me feel." The laughter grew louder. Someone clapped. Another guest whistled. I sat there dripping and stunned, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. This was my daughter's wedding day and I had become the entertainment, but then something strange happened. Instead of the crushing embarrassment I should have felt, a calm settled over me. A clarity I hadn't experienced in years. I stood up slowly, garbage juice still dripping from my hair and clothes. Without hurrying, I walked to the front of the room where Walter stood grinning beside the microphone. "May I?" I asked, gesturing to the microphone. Walter, still smirking, handed it over. "Sure, let's hear what you have to say." I looked out at the crowd of faces, some still chuckling, others watching with curious anticipation. I found Stella's eyes across the room. She looked confident, proud even, as if she'd finally put me in my place. I leaned into the microphone and spoke just 3 words. Check the will. The effect was immediate and electric. Walter's face went from smug satisfaction to pure terror in the span of a heartbeat. The color drained from his cheeks so quickly I thought he might faint. "What did you say?" he whispered, but the microphone picked it up, broadcasting his panic to the entire room. I handed the microphone back to him calmly and walked toward the exit. Behind me, I could hear Walter's voice rising to a shout, calling my name, but I didn't turn around. For the first time in years, I felt powerful. As I drove home in my garbage-stained suit, my mind drifted back to how things had gotten so bad between us. It hadn't always been like this. When Stella was little, before Sarah died, we were a family. I worked double shifts at the plant to pay for Stella's dance lessons, her summer camps, her college fund. Sarah and I went without so Stella could have everything we never did. But after Sarah's funeral 8 years ago, something changed in Stella. The grief hit us both hard, but instead of bringing us together, it seemed to drive a wedge between us. She started seeing me differently, like I was a reminder of everything she'd lost instead of the one person who understood her pain. The shift became obvious when she brought Walter home for the first time 3 years ago. I was excited to meet him, eager to welcome someone new into our small family. I'd made dinner, nothing fancy, just pot roast and potatoes, and cleaned my apartment until it sparkled. Walter walked in wearing a suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. He looked around my humble living room with barely concealed disgust, taking in the second-hand furniture and faded family photos. "So this is where Stella grew up," he said, making it sound like a social worker's observation rather than a comment about my home. During dinner, he questioned everything. Why had I never gone to college? Why did I stay at the factory for 37 years? Why didn't I have better insurance when Sarah got sick? "Dad never really had much ambition," Stella explained, like I wasn't sitting right there. "Mom was always the one with dreams." I bit my tongue then, like I would countless times afterward. I didn't tell them about the promotion I'd turned down because it would have meant traveling and missing Stella's school plays. I didn't mention the business loan I'd qualified for, but never took because Sarah wanted the security of my steady paycheck. I didn't explain how I'd cashed in my retirement fund early to pay for Sarah's experimental treatments, the ones insurance wouldn't cover. After that first dinner, the visits became more frequent, but I was increasingly treated like a burden. Walter would make jokes about my simple lifestyle and my quaint little apartment. Stella would laugh along, agreeing with his observations about how much better her life was now that she'd elevated herself from her upbringing. The breaking point came when they got engaged 18 months ago. They invited me to dinner at an expensive restaurant downtown, the kind of place where the menu doesn't list prices and the waiter looks at you suspiciously if you're not wearing the right kind of clothes. "Dad, we have something important to tell you," Stella said, her diamond engagement ring catching the candlelight. Walter had proposed with a ring worth more than my car, and Stella hadn't stopped talking about it for weeks. "We're getting married next fall," she announced, "and we've been talking about the wedding arrangements." I smiled, genuinely happy for her, despite everything. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Have you set a date?" Walter leaned forward, his expression serious. "We have, actually. October 15th. It's going to be quite an event. 300 guests, reception at the country club, the works. I'd like to help with the costs," I offered, even though I knew my savings wouldn't cover much of what they were describing. Stella and Walter exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. "Actually, Dad, that's what we wanted to talk to you about," Stella said carefully. "Walter's family is handling all the expenses. They're very traditional about these things. They want to make sure everything is done properly." "What she's trying to say," Walter interrupted, "is that we need to discuss your role in the wedding, my role, like I was an employee they were hiring, not the father of the bride. We've decided it would be best if you kept a low profile," Stella continued. "Walter's colleagues will be there, important people from his family's social circle. We just want to make sure everything goes smoothly." "I understand," I said, though I didn't really understand at all. "Great," Walter said, signaling for the check. "We knew you'd be reasonable about this." As the months passed, my role in the wedding planning became clearer. I had none. I wasn't consulted about anything. When I asked about the guest list, Stella told me not to worry about it. When I offered to give a father of the bride speech, Walter laughed and said they were keeping the toasts short and professional. 3 weeks before the wedding, Stella came to my apartment. It was the first time she'd visited in over a year, and I was so happy to see her that I didn't notice the lawyer's envelope in her hand at first. "Dad, I need you to sign something," she said, sitting on my old couch like it might contaminate her designer dress. The papers were complicated, full of legal language I didn't understand, but the general idea was clear enough. Stella wanted me to sign over my rights to Sarah's life insurance policy, $25,000 that I'd been planning to leave to Stella anyway, eventually. It's just a formality, she explained. Walter thinks it would be better to have everything sorted out before the wedding, for tax purposes. I stared at the papers, my throat tight. Stella, this money, I was saving it for you. For your future. I know, Dad, and this way I'll have it now when Walter and I can really use it. We're looking at houses, and a down payment would make such a difference. I signed the papers because I loved her, because I wanted her to be happy, because I still believed that deep down, despite everything, she loved me too. Now, sitting in my car outside my apartment building with garbage juice dried on my shirt, I finally understood the truth. To Stella and Walter, I wasn't a father or family member. I was an obstacle to be managed, a source of embarrassment to be minimized, and apparently a source of income to be drained. But they'd made one crucial mistake. In all their planning and scheming, they'd assumed I was as simple and powerless as I appeared. They had no idea that over the past year, while they'd been treating me like a fool, I'd been making plans of my own. The will they thought they understood was about to become their worst nightmare. I was still sitting in my car when my phone started ringing. Walter's name flashed on the screen and I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again and again. By the fourth call, I turned the phone off entirely. Whatever panic was consuming him could wait. Inside my apartment, I peeled off my ruined suit and threw it in the trash. It had served its purpose. I showered, letting the hot water wash away the garbage juice and the last traces of my old, naive self. When I emerged, I felt cleaner than I had in years. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at my kitchen table, looking at the manila folder I'd been keeping in my desk drawer for the past 8 months. Inside were copies of emails, text messages, bank statements, and legal documents that told a story Walter and Stella thought no one would ever piece together. It had started by accident, really. 6 months after Walter proposed to Stella, I'd been having computer problems. My old laptop was acting up and Stella suggested I bring it to Walter's office. Apparently his company had an IT department that could fix it cheaply. I'd dropped it off on a Tuesday afternoon. Walter wasn't there, but his assistant, a young woman named Jennifer, was helpful. She explained that their IT guy was out sick, but she could take a look at it herself. I'm pretty good with computers, she said with a smile. Used to work tech support before I got this job. While she worked on my laptop, we chatted. Jennifer was friendly, the kind of person who talks easily with strangers. She mentioned how much she liked working for Walter's firm, though she seemed a bit puzzled by some things. Mr. Patterson seems really interested in family law lately, she said, typing something into my computer. Which is weird, because we're a corporate firm. We don't usually handle divorce cases or inheritance disputes. My ears perked up. Family law? Yeah, he's been researching stuff about inheritance rights, how to contest wills, that sort of thing. He even had me print out information about something called undue influence last week. She shrugged. Maybe he's thinking about changing career paths. I kept my expression neutral, but my mind was racing. That does sound unusual. The really weird thing is he's been asking me to help him with personal research too. Like, he had me look up information about your daughter's family history, birth certificates, property records, that kind of thing. I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but it seemed kind of invasive. My blood went cold. What kind of information? Jennifer glanced around, then leaned closer. Well, he was really interested in your wife's death certificate and your financial records from around that time. He also had me research whether your daughter had any claim to your ex-wife's family property. She paused. Your ex-wife? I assumed since he was looking into divorce records. My wife died 8 years ago, I said quietly. Jennifer's face went pale. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I just assumed. Why would he be looking into? She trailed off, the implications hitting her. Could you print me copies of what he had you research? I asked. She hesitated. I probably shouldn't. Jennifer, I think my daughter might be in trouble. If Walter is researching ways to contest wills or manipulate inheritance laws, she could be walking into something dangerous. That's how it started. Jennifer, bless her heart, was horrified when she realized she might have been helping Walter plan something harmful. Over the next few weeks, she discreetly provided me with copies of everything Walter had been researching. The picture that emerged was chilling. Walter hadn't just fallen in love with Stella. He'd researched her financial background thoroughly before even asking her out. He knew about Sarah's life insurance policy, about the small inheritance Stella would receive from her grandmother's estate, about the property Sarah's family owned upstate, but more than that, he'd been planning for my death. The documents Jennifer provided showed that Walter had researched what would happen to my assets when I died, how quickly an inheritance could be probated, and most disturbing of all, How to challenge a will if the contents weren't what he expected. I'd spent the next 6 months gathering more evidence. I started recording our conversations whenever Walter was around. I documented every instance of financial manipulation, every time they'd pressured me to sign something or hand over money. I even hired a private investigator to look into Walter's background. What I found was even worse than I'd imagined. Walter had done this before. Not marriage exactly, but he had a pattern of targeting older people with assets. His previous girlfriend had been a widow whose husband had left her a substantial pension. That relationship had ended abruptly when she'd changed her will to benefit a charity instead of Walter. Before that, he'd been involved with a woman whose elderly father owned valuable property. Walter had convinced her to pressure her father into selling the land, with Walter handling the transaction. The father had died shortly after the sale, and the daughter discovered that Walter had structured the deal to benefit himself far more than her family. The most damning evidence came from Walter's own communications. Jennifer had access to his work email, and she'd found messages to a lawyer discussing strategies for maximizing inheritance benefits and timeline considerations for elderly dependents. In one particularly chilling email exchange, Walter had written, "The old man seems healthy enough, but he's 66 and worked a physical job his whole life. Statistically, I probably won't have to wait too long. The key is making sure everything is set up properly beforehand." The lawyer had responded with advice about positioning himself as Stella's financial advisor, getting power of attorney if possible, and ensuring that any will I might have would be contestable if necessary. They were planning my funeral before I was even sick. But the most heartbreaking discovery was Stella's involvement. I'd hoped, even as the evidence mounted, that she was innocent. That Walter was manipulating her just like he was trying to manipulate me. The text messages Jennifer found proved otherwise. Stella and Walter had been discussing my assets for months. She'd sent him copies of financial documents she'd convinced me to share with her. She'd even joked about how pathetically eager I was to help them. In one message, she'd written, "Dad signed over the insurance money just like you said he would. He's so desperate to feel useful. It's actually kind of sad." Walter had replied, "Don't feel bad. We're doing him a favor. At least this way his money will go to someone who can actually use it properly." Another exchange had nearly made me sick. "Do you think he suspects anything?" Stella had asked. "Are you kidding? He's completely clueless. The man thinks we actually want him at the wedding. I almost feel guilty sometimes." "Don't. He's had his whole life to make something of himself. It's not our fault he never did." I'd read those messages 3 times before I could fully process them. My daughter, the little girl I'd carried on my shoulders to the zoo, who I'd taught to ride a bike, who I'd held when she cried about her mother's death, that daughter saw me as nothing more than a wallet to be emptied. That's when I'd made my own plans. I'd called my lawyer, James Morrison, who'd been handling my affairs since Sarah died. I'd known James for 15 years, and he'd always been straight with me. "Martin, are you sure about this?" he'd asked when I explained what I wanted to do. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The new will I'd signed 3 months ago was very different from the one Stella and Walter thought existed. They were expecting to inherit my modest savings, my apartment, and whatever remained of Sarah's insurance money. They had no idea that I'd been far more successful than anyone knew. Now, sitting in my kitchen with the evidence spread out before me, I finally felt ready for what was coming. My phone, which I'd turned back on, showed 17 missed calls from Walter and 9 from Stella. The messages were getting increasingly frantic. The last one from Walter simply said, "We need to talk. Now." I smiled and put the phone back in my pocket. We would talk, all right. But this time, the conversation would go very differently than they expected. Walter showed up at my apartment at 11 that night. I wasn't surprised. I'd been expecting him. What did surprise me was that Stella wasn't with him. Apparently, even she had limits to how far she'd go for Walter's schemes. I could hear him pacing in the hallway before he knocked, his footsteps heavy and agitated. When I opened the door, he looked like he'd aged 10 years since the wedding. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and there was a wild look in his eyes that I'd never seen before. "Martin, we need to talk," he said, pushing past me into my apartment without being invited. "Come in," I said dryly, closing the door behind him. He spun around to face me, his composure completely gone. "What did you mean when you said check the will?" "What will?" "You don't have anything worth putting in a will." I walked to my kitchen and poured myself another cup of coffee, taking my time. "Would you like some coffee, Walter? You look like you could use it." "Don't play games with me, old man," he snapped. "I've been researching your finances for months. You live in a 1-bedroom apartment, you drive a 15-year-old car, your Social Security barely covers your expenses. What will could you possibly have that would matter to anyone?" I sat down at my kitchen table and gestured to the chair across from me. "Sit down, Walter. Let's have that conversation you wanted." He remained standing, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Just tell me what you meant." "I meant exactly what I said. Check the will." I took a sip of my coffee. Though I suppose I should be more specific. Check the new will. The color drained from his face. New will? The one I signed 3 months ago, right around the time I found out about your little research project into my family's finances. Walter's legs seemed to give out, and he dropped into the chair across from me. What are you talking about? I opened the folder I'd left on the table and pulled out a photograph. It was a picture of Walter's office building taken by the private investigator I'd hired. Nice building, I said conversationally. Very impressive address. I don't understand what you're getting at. I pulled out another document, copies of the emails Jennifer had provided. These are interesting reading, especially the parts where you discuss timeline considerations for elderly dependents and strategies for maximizing inheritance benefits. Walter went completely still. Where did you get those? Does it matter? The important thing is that I have them. All of them. Including the text messages between you and my daughter discussing how pathetically eager I am to help you. He stared at the papers in front of him, his breathing shallow. You don't understand. Stella and I were planning for the future. We were just trying to be practical about finances. Practical, I nodded thoughtfully. Is that what you call researching inheritance laws and discussing how long you'll have to wait for me to die? Walter's hands were shaking now. That's not. You're taking things out of context. I pulled out more documents. Let me give you some context, Walter. These are copies of the research you had your assistant do on my background. Very thorough. You found out about Sarah's life insurance, about her family's property upstate, about the modest savings I was supposed to have. Supposed to have? That's the thing about assumptions, Walter. Sometimes they're wrong. I leaned back in my chair. You researched Martin Holloway, retired factory worker, Social Security recipient, resident of Maple Grove Apartments. Walter was staring at me now with growing confusion and fear. But you didn't research Martin H. Industries, did you? The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Walter's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. What? Martin H. Industries, small investment company, started about 12 years ago. Very quiet operation, mostly real estate and technology investments. Nothing flashy, nothing that would show up in a casual background check. Walter was shaking his head slowly. That's impossible. You're a factory worker. You live in a one-bedroom apartment. I am a factory worker, I agreed. Retired now, obviously, and I do live in a one-bedroom apartment. I like the simplicity, but that doesn't mean I don't have other assets. I pulled out the final document in my folder, a bank statement. Not my regular checking account, the one Walter had somehow obtained records for, but a different account entirely. One with a balance that made Walter's eyes go wide. $2.7 million, I said quietly. That's just the liquid assets. The real estate portfolio is worth considerably more. Walter stared at the statement like it was written in a foreign language. This is fake. This has to be fake. Call the bank tomorrow if you want. First National Downtown Branch. Ask for Margaret Chen. She's been my private banker for 8 years. How? Walter's voice was barely a whisper. Remember when Sarah got sick? When I told everyone I'd cashed in my retirement fund to pay for her treatments? I took another sip of coffee. That was true. But what I didn't mention was that I'd been investing in real estate on the side for 20 years. Small properties at first, then bigger ones. When Sarah needed the experimental treatments, I didn't cash in my retirement fund. I sold 2 apartment buildings. Walter was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. After Sarah died, I threw myself into the business. It was the only thing that kept me sane. Buying properties, fixing them up, selling them for profit. Then I started investing in tech startups, small companies that reminded me of myself, underestimated, overlooked, but solid. But your apartment, your car, your clothes. I like my apartment. I've lived there for 12 years and it suits me. The car runs fine, and clothes. I shrugged. At my age, comfort matters more than fashion. Walter's breathing was becoming more rapid. So the will. The old will left everything to Stella, every penny. I wanted her to be secure, to have opportunities I never had. I leaned forward. But the new will is very different. Different how? The new will leaves $5,000 to Stella, enough for a nice vacation or a small down payment on something. The rest, all $2.7 million in liquid assets plus the real estate portfolio worth approximately $4.2 million, goes to the American Cancer Society. Walter's face went white. You can't do that. I already have. She's your daughter. She was my daughter. The daughter I knew died the day she started helping you plan my funeral. I stood up and walked to the window. Did you really think I wouldn't find out, Walter? Did you think I was so stupid, so helpless, that I wouldn't notice you researching inheritance laws and discussing my death like it was a business opportunity? Walter jumped up from his chair. This is insane. You can't cut Stella out of your will because of a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? I turned back to face him. Is that what you call it when you research someone's finances without their knowledge, manipulate their daughter into helping you access their assets, and plan strategies for contesting their will if it doesn't benefit you? We never meant any harm. Really? Then explain this. I pulled out my phone and played one of the recordings I'd made. Walter's own voice filled the room. The old man is completely clueless. He actually thinks we want him at the wedding. Walter's shoulders sagged as he heard his own words played back to him. Or this one. I played another recording, this time Stella's voice. Dad's so desperate to feel useful. It's actually kind of sad. Walter sank back into the chair, his head in his hands. Here's what's going to happen, Walter, I said, my voice calm but firm. You're going to leave my apartment and never contact me again. You're going to stop researching my finances, stop planning for my death, and stop treating my daughter like a co-conspirator in your schemes. And if I don't, then I take all of this evidence to the police. Financial fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy. I'm sure they'll find something that sticks. Plus, I have a few friends at the newspaper who would be very interested in a story about a corporate lawyer who preys on elderly people and their families. Walter looked up at me, his face a mask of defeat and rage. You think you're so smart, don't you? No, Walter, I think I'm a father who finally woke up to what his daughter had become, and I think I'm a man who refuses to be anyone's victim. He stood up slowly, straightening his rumpled suit. Stella's going to be devastated when she finds out about the will. Stella made her choice when she decided to help you. Now she gets to live with the consequences. Walter walked toward the door, then paused. This isn't over. Yes, it is, I said quietly. It's been over since the moment you dumped that garbage on my head. You just didn't know it yet. After he left, I sat in my quiet apartment, feeling truly at peace for the first time in years. My phone was buzzing with more calls from Stella, but I didn't answer. There would be time for that conversation later, when she was ready to hear the truth about what she'd become. For now, I was content to sit in the silence, knowing that I'd finally taken control of my own story. Stella didn't call the next day, or the day after that. It wasn't until Thursday, 3 days after her wedding, that she finally showed up at my door. I'd been expecting her sooner, but I supposed Walter needed time to figure out how to break the news to her. When I opened the door, she looked nothing like the radiant bride from Saturday night. Her hair was unwashed, her makeup smeared, and she was wearing an old college sweatshirt I remembered buying her years ago. For a moment, seeing her like that, I almost felt sorry for her. Dad, she said, her voice small and broken. We need to talk. I stepped aside to let her in. She walked to my couch and sat down heavily, like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. Walter told me about your conversation, she said without looking at me. Did he tell you all of it? She nodded slowly. About the will, about the money, about... She swallowed hard. About what we did. I sat down in my armchair across from her, the same chair I'd sat in when she was little and would curl up on the couch to watch movies with me. Back when things were simple, back when she loved me. I need to know something, Stella, I said quietly. Was any of it real? The last few years, the engagement, asking me to be part of your life again, was any of it genuine, or was it all just part of Walter's plan? She was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands. When she finally looked up, there were tears in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of remorse or self-pity. It started out real, she said finally. When I first brought Walter home, I really did want you to like each other. I wanted us to be a family. But he started pointing things out. About your apartment, your job, the way you dressed. He said it was embarrassing to have a father-in-law who looked like he couldn't take care of himself. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. He said people would judge him based on his association with you. I felt the familiar ache in my chest, but this time it was mixed with something else. Disappointment so deep it felt like drowning. And you agreed with him? I didn't want to at first, but then I started seeing it too. The way his friends looked at you when you came to dinner. The way his parents talked about different backgrounds and social compatibility. I started feeling ashamed. Ashamed of me. Ashamed of where I came from, of being the daughter of a factory worker who lived in a tiny apartment and drove an old car. She was crying openly now. Walter made me feel like I could be someone better, someone more refined. He said I deserved a life where I didn't have to worry about money or what people thought of my family. So you decided to help him research my finances. She flinched. That wasn't supposed to hurt you. Walter said it was just about planning for the future, making sure we could take care of you when you got older. He made it sound like we were being responsible. And the jokes about how pathetic I was, the text messages about how desperately eager I was to help you. Stella's face crumpled. I know how that sounds now, but at the time Walter made it seem like we were just being realistic about your limitations. He said it was better to be honest about your situation than to pretend you were something you weren't. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where my old Honda sat next to the sleek cars of my younger neighbors. Do you want to know something funny, Stella? Walter was right about one thing. I'm not the man you thought I was. Dad, I'm sorry. I know we were wrong. I know we hurt you, but maybe we can work this out. Maybe you could change the will back and we could start over. I turned to face her. Start over? After everything you've done, you think we can just start over? People make mistakes, Dad. Families forgive each other. Families, I repeated. Is that what we are? Of course we are. I'm your daughter. You raised me. You loved me. I raised someone, I interrupted. I loved someone. But the woman sitting on my couch right now, the woman who helped her husband plan my funeral while I was still alive, the woman who laughed when he humiliated me at her wedding, I don't know who that is. Stella stood up abruptly. Don't you dare act like you're the victim here. You lied to me. All these years you let me think you were poor, that you were struggling, that you needed my help. I never asked for your help. You offered the help and I accepted it because I thought it came from love, but you had millions of dollars. You could have made our lives so much easier. And there it was. The real Stella, the one Walter had cultivated and encouraged. Not the grieving daughter who'd lost her way, but the entitled woman who believed my money belonged to her. Could I have made your life easier? Yes. Should I have told you about the business? Maybe, but would it have changed anything? I shook my head. You weren't ashamed of me because you thought I was poor, Stella. You were ashamed of me because I wasn't the kind of father who could elevate your social status. If I'd told you about the money years ago, you would have wanted me to spend it on the right clothes, the right car, the right apartment in the right neighborhood. You would have wanted me to become someone else entirely. That's not true, isn't it? When's the last time you asked me how I was feeling? When's the last time you called just to talk, not because you needed something? When's the last time you treated me like a person instead of an obligation? She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. We both knew the truth. The money was never the real issue, I continued. The real issue was that you stopped seeing me as your father and started seeing me as a burden. Walter just gave you permission to act on feelings you already had. Stella sank back down onto the couch. So that's it? You're cutting me out of your life forever? I'm not cutting you out, Stella. You cut yourself out the day you decided I wasn't good enough to be part of your new life. But the will stands. $5,000 is more than enough for someone who sees their father as an embarrassment to be managed. She was quiet for a long time and I could see her processing everything. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen since she was a teenager. Genuine fear. Walter's going to leave me, she said quietly. Probably. He only married me for the money. Once he realizes there isn't any, he'll find some reason to divorce me. Probably, I said again. What am I supposed to do? For the first time since she'd arrived, I felt a flicker of the old protective instinct. This was my daughter, scared and alone, asking her father for help. But then I remembered the recording of her voice, laughing about how pathetic I was, and the feeling faded. You're going to figure it out, I said, just like I had to figure it out when you and Walter decided I wasn't worth your respect. She stared at me for a long moment, as if waiting for me to change my mind, to tell her everything would be okay, to fix the mess she'd made of her life. When I didn't, she stood up and walked toward the door. I hope you're happy, she said, her voice bitter. You've got your revenge. This isn't revenge, Stella. Revenge would be if I'd planned all this to hurt you. This is just me finally learning to value myself the way you never did. After she left, I sat in my quiet apartment and thought about the conversation. I'd expected to feel victorious or at least satisfied. Instead, I felt empty. Not sad exactly, but hollow, like something that had been part of me for 32 years had simply disappeared. I walked to my bedroom and opened the closet, pulling out a box I'd kept on the top shelf for years. Inside were photographs of Stella growing up. Her first day of school, her high school graduation, the day she got accepted to college. Pictures of a little girl who used to climb into my lap and fall asleep while I read her stories. I looked at those pictures for a long time, trying to reconcile the child in the photographs with the woman who'd just left my apartment. Somewhere along the way, I'd lost her. Or maybe she'd lost herself. Either way, that little girl was gone, and I was finally ready to stop pretending she was coming back. I put the box away and went to make dinner. Tomorrow, I would call my lawyer and make sure everything was in order. I would continue living my quiet life, maybe travel a bit, maybe find some charity work to keep me busy. But tonight, I would mourn the daughter I'd lost, and then I would move on. 6 months later, I was sitting in a cafe in downtown Portland, watching the rain streak down the windows and feeling more at peace than I had in years. I'd sold my apartment in Ohio and bought a small house near the coast, something I'd always dreamed of doing but never thought I could afford, at least not while everyone believed I was just a poor retiree. The move had been liberating in ways I hadn't expected. No one here knew my story. Knew about Stella or Walter or the humiliation at the wedding. I was just Martin, the quiet man who bought coffee at the same cafe every Tuesday and Thursday, who volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends, who kept his yard neat and always had a friendly word for his neighbors. I was reading the newspaper when I saw the headline in the society section, "Local corporate lawyer files for divorce after brief marriage." The accompanying photo showed Walter in his expensive suit, looking haggard and defensive outside what appeared to be a courthouse. The article was brief but told the story clearly enough. Walter Patterson, junior partner at Morrison Wells and Associates, was seeking divorce from his wife of 6 months, citing irreconcilable differences and financial incompatibility. The journalist had done their homework. There were references to alleged financial misrepresentations and disputed asset claims. I folded the paper and set it aside. I felt nothing, no satisfaction, no vindication, not even sadness. It was just information about people who were no longer part of my life. The waitress, a young woman named Emma, who always remembered that I liked my coffee black, came over to refill my cup. "You look thoughtful today, Mr. Martin," she said with a smile. "Just reading about other people's troubles," I said. "Makes me grateful for the quiet life. That's a good way to look at it. My grandmother always said that drama follows people who invite it in." I thought about that as I walked home. Had I invited the drama with Stella and Walter? Had I somehow encouraged their behavior by being too accommodating, too eager to please, too willing to ignore the warning signs? Maybe, but it didn't matter anymore. I'd learned the lesson, painful as it was, and now I could move forward. At home, I found an envelope that had been slipped under my door. My name was written on it in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a short letter. "Dear Mr. Holloway, you don't know me, but my name is Jennifer Mills. I used to work as Walter Patterson's assistant. I wanted you to know that I've left that job and started working for a legal aid organization that helps elderly people protect themselves from financial abuse. I want to thank you for opening my eyes to what was happening. I hope you're doing well. Jennifer." At the bottom, she'd included her new contact information and a note. "If you ever want to talk about your experience or help other people in similar situations, please call me." I set the letter on my kitchen table and made myself a sandwich. Jennifer's note reminded me that my experience with Stella and Walter, painful as it had been, might actually serve a purpose. There were probably other elderly people out there being manipulated by family members or supposed loved ones who saw them as nothing more than sources of income. That evening I called Jennifer. "Mr. Holloway," her voice was warm and surprised. "I wasn't sure you'd want to hear from me. I appreciated your letter. Tell me about this legal aid organization." She explained that Elder Advocates was a nonprofit that provided free legal services to seniors who were being financially exploited. They also offered education programs to help older adults recognize the warning signs of abuse and protect themselves. "We could really use someone with your experience," Jennifer said. "Someone who's been through it and came out the other side. A lot of our clients feel ashamed, like they should have known better. Hearing from someone who understands might help them." I thought about it for a week before I called her back and agreed to volunteer. Not as a spokesperson or a public figure, but as someone who could sit quietly with frightened elderly people and tell them they weren't stupid. They weren't alone and they could take back control of their lives. The work was surprisingly fulfilling. I met with people who'd been manipulated by adult children, grandchildren, caregivers, and romantic partners. I listened to stories that were heartbreakingly similar to my own. Families who saw their elderly relatives as ATMs, who isolated them from friends, who made them feel worthless and grateful for any scrap of attention. One woman, Dorothy, reminded me particularly of myself. Her son had convinced her to sign over power of attorney, then systematically emptied her savings account. When she questioned him, he told her she was getting senile and couldn't be trusted to manage her own affairs. "I started believing him," she told me during one of our sessions. "I thought maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe I couldn't take care of myself anymore." "But you could," I said. "And you did. You're here, you got help, you took action. That takes strength. I just feel so stupid. He's my son. I raised him. How could I not see what he was doing? Because you loved him, because you trusted him, because you believed that the relationship you had when he was a child still existed." I paused. "Sometimes people change, and sometimes we have to accept that the person we loved is gone." Dorothy nodded, tears in her eyes. "Do you ever miss her, your daughter?" I considered the question carefully. "I miss the daughter I thought I had. But I don't miss the stress, the manipulation, the constant feeling that I wasn't good enough. I don't miss walking on eggshells or being grateful for scraps of affection. Are you happy now?" I thought about my small house by the coast, my quiet mornings with coffee and newspapers, my volunteer work, the neighbors who waved when they saw me working in my garden. I thought about sleeping peacefully without worrying about what Stella or Walter might want from me next. Yes, I said, I'm happy. A year after the wedding, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I heard Stella's voice, and for a moment, my heart clenched with the old automatic response. Dad? It's me. Hello, Stella. I wanted to call and tell you that Walter and I are getting divorced. It's final next week. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? Her voice was bitter. You were right about him. About everything. He left me for his secretary 3 months after he realized you weren't leaving us any money. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. I lost the house, she continued, and most of my savings, and I had to move back in with Mom's sister in Cleveland. My sister-in-law Ruth was a good woman. Stella would be fine there. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, Stella said, about the things I said and did. I know I hurt you. Yes, you did. I was wondering, is there any chance we could try again? Maybe start over? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 32 years of fatherhood, of love and disappointment and hope and betrayal. I don't think so, Stella. But I'm your daughter. I'm all the family you have left. No, I said quietly. You were my daughter, and you're not all the family I have. I've found family in other places with other people who value me for who I am, not what I can give them. There was a long silence. Then, the will. Is there any chance? Goodbye, Stella. I hung up and turned off my phone. Outside my window, the sun was setting over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that took my breath away. I made myself a simple dinner, read a book, and went to bed early. For the first time in my adult life, I slept without the weight of anyone else's expectations or demands pressing down on me. I slept the sleep of a man who had finally learned that being alone was better than being with people who made you feel worthless. In the morning, I would wake up in my own house, drink my coffee in peace, and spend the day exactly as I chose to spend it. I would work in my garden, read my books, help other people who had been where I'd been. I would live the life I'd earned, surrounded by people who appreciated me and free from those who didn't. And for an old factory worker who'd been dumped with garbage juice at his daughter's wedding, that felt like the greatest victory of all.